Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar series of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the University of Canberra. Today is a special seminar because we're kicking off a new seminar series, a 5-part series on identity, democracy, and self-transformation, in which we will explore various topics around the question of what role our identities plays in democracy, which freedoms we have in producing ourselves, in performing ourselves, and in changing also the perception of ourselves. So my name is Hans Asenbaum. I'm a senior research fellow here at the center. And I would like to acknowledge that the University of Canberra is here on unceded land of the Ngunnawal people. We respect their elders, past, present, and emerging. And we would like to express our deep appreciation for the contributions they are making to the development of this beautiful country. So we're very, very happy that we kick off this series with none other than Professor Anne Phillips. I will briefly introduce Professor Phillips and then hand over to her for her talk for about a half an hour, and then we have about a half an hour for discussion. So Anne Phillips is Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the London School of Economics, where she previously was the Graham Wallace Professor of Political Science. Of course, we all know Anne Phillips' work because it's at this very stimulating intersection between feminist theory, gender studies, and democratic theory. Anne has contributed so much to this field and to shaping this field from her early works to her present books. I'm just going to name a few of the highlights here. Engendering Democracy, The Politics of Presence, of course, the concept that has so much shaped our discussions today, up to the present books, Our Bodies, Whose Property, The Politics of the Human, and quite recently, Unconditional Equals. Anne has a long relationship with the center, with several visits at the center, and we hope, Anne, that we can welcome you in person here also in the near future. For now, we're looking forward to your seminar, which is entitled Beyond the Binary, Would Abolishing the Legal Status of Gender Undermine the Efforts to Address the Underrepresentation of Women in Politics? So, Anne, thank you so much for being here, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. And can I just say, following on from your introduction, Hans, how disappointed I was, as I'm sure all you were, that the referendum on The Voice wasn't successful. I think it would have been a great step forward for the representation of Indigenous Australians and indeed for Australian democracy. But referendums can happen again, and who knows what might be possible in the future. So. My paper begins from a long-standing concern with the underrepresentation in contemporary democracies of women relative to men, people from ethnic minorities relative to people from ethnic majorities, people from working class backgrounds relative to those from privileged backgrounds. I mean, in the context of deliberative forums, of course, it's possible and very common to operate some kind of randomized selection of participants, and that goes some way towards addressing the way participation is always skewed towards already privileged groups. Though I even here, I think, even in randomized selection, the willingness or the ability to participate is often affected by people's economic and class position. But changing the pattern in elected assemblies is more difficult and typically depends on operating some form of target or quota in the selection of candidates from the underrepresented groups. It's also the other main strategy is to redraw the boundaries of constituencies so as to increase the voting strength of the underrepresented group, which was one of the things that proved important in improving the representation of African and Latino Americans in the United States. But one difficulty with any of the mechanisms that we've come up with is that they depend on categorizing people into the or overrepresented groups, and yet people rarely fall into transparent binary categories. I think this is self-evidently the case as regards social class, not only because, I mean, there are multiple schemas for identifying, which social class any of us belongs to. Is it by wealth, education, occupation, possession of cultural capital, or what have you? But also people change class, and it might be said that people change their class position in the moment of being elected as a political representative. As regards race, well, the very construction of racial categories is itself ideological, often depending on spurious associations between how people look and what they are, and sometimes making the authenticity of representation depend on skin tone. So, are you considered dark enough or light enough to really represent your group? And then there's a further problem with racial representation, which is that if you do take a simple binary between white and non-white as the only salient feature, you can't begin to address the multiplicity of racial identities. So, you're left with, is a racial quota fulfilled by the election of anyone perceived as non-white, regardless of which particular racialized group they come from, or indeed regardless of how their racial identity might intersect with class status. So that's my starting observation. Any attempt to address underrepresentation, which I regard as a really important challenge for democracy, any attempt seems to involve categorizing people, and mostly in a binary way. And I think it's partly because of that measures relating to gender have had much greater success in recent decades than measures relating to other axes of underrepresentation. I mean, by comparison with class or race or sexuality, identifying who is or who is not a woman has seemed pretty straightforward. And the fact that a tiny proportion of the population transitions from one gender identity to another has not seemed a major complication. So just to anticipate what I'm going to say, it remains my view that this is not a major complication, but I found it helpful in the context of current discussions about gender identity, but particularly gender transition. I found it helpful to go back over some of the issues about what counts as representation in the light of recent debates about the nature of gender identity and the conditions under which people can change their gender. This has been a hugely vexed topic in the UK in recent years, and in fact is one of the weapons currently wielded by politicians in the so-called culture wars. In the UK, there was a Gender Recognition Act in 2004 that allowed for those who have transitioned from male to female or female to male to be issued with a gender recognition certificate in their new identity. However, this is subject to a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, evidence that they've lived in their acquired gender for at least 2 years before applying, and the declared intention of living in the new identity for the rest of their life. And the delays, the medicalization, the requirement to present oneself as suffering a form of mental illness have been much criticized. And a number of countries now operate alternative systems of self-certification. And there was a 2-year public consultation in the UK about whether to move in that direction, but it proved highly controversial, producing a great deal of heat and no change. And as some of you probably know, the Scottish Parliament did pass legislation in 2022 allowing for sincere self-identification as a sufficient basis for recognizing the change of gender identity. But the UK Parliament used previously unused powers to block this, and the future of the Scottish legislation remains at this point unclear. So the wider debate has generated highly polarized, distressingly angry counterpositions. So with one side conjuring up scenarios of multiple men declaring themselves female in order to prey on vulnerable girls and women, the other side responding with accusations of transphobia. And in the process, particularly distressing as regards the kind of the feminist arguments, we've witnessed a kind of an unhelpful reassertion of the centrality of biology in determining what counts as a woman, as if all those decades in which, feminists explored the implications of Simone de Beauvoir's famous "one is not born, but rather becomes a woman," as if all those had never happened, but also as if there were no ambiguity in the biology itself. I mean, in fact, the frequency of births involving some kind of genital anomaly, so some kind of intersex trait, is estimated as 1 in 200 or 1 in 300, though the proportion significant enough to raise questions about how to allocate a child's sex is closer to 1 in 5,000. I only know that because I recently examined a fascinating PhD thesis on the whole kind of politics and discourses around intersex. Biology does not speak as clearly as some people seem to think. But also, of course, when we're engaging with questions about subordination or exclusion or underrepresentation, it's pretty clear that something other than biology is going on. So what I want to talk about is what problems, if any, arise in the field of political representation if we were to adopt either gender self-recognition, that is, with minimal sort of involvement of others, just the evidence that you're living in your acquired gender, that you're committed to doing this for the known future. So if we adopted either gender self-recognition or, more radically, the proposal I'm particularly interested in, entirely abandon the legal status of gender. Much of the critical opposition to either of these proposals centers on issues of safety, and particularly the safety of women and girls. So having clearly defined sex identities is thought to provide important protections, against boys intruding on girls' spaces in school toilets, against men representing themselves as women in order to infiltrate women-only spaces in changing rooms, prisons, women's refuges. And clearly defined sex identities are also thought to be crucial in ensuring a clear basis for identifying discrimination against women. I'm not going to address all these, though I'll say something about the second one, but I'm just going to focus on the representational questions. And as I say, I'm especially intrigued by proposals regarding abandoning the legal status of gender entirely. So this was something, I don't know the full history of it, but I know it was proposed by a gathering of human rights experts in what's known as the Yogyakarta Principles, which was drawn up as in a 2006 meeting in Indonesia. And it's been more recently recommended by UK legal theorist Davina Cooper, who's completed a 4-year research project on the future of legal gender. And if you want to sort of check up that, the report is all available on the web if you just look Future of Legal Gender, Davina Cooper. So Cooper argues that our lives could go better in many ways if we didn't have this legally regulated status. I mean, the most general being that it could help reduce the tendency to think that who we are and what we can become is determined by the nature of our genitals. And it would free us from at least some of the weight of gender expectations and norms if we went, stamped as, you're male, you're female. The most specific is that it would make procedures for formal gender transitioning redundant. If you didn't have a legal identity as either male or female, you wouldn't have to apply to be re-recognized as a different gender. And it would remove the pressure on those who identify as non-binary to make their choice between either female or male. So all that sounds good. The question then is whether there are nonetheless compelling reasons to hold on to a strict male-female binary grounded in the sex allocated to us at birth, marked on our birth certificates, in order successfully to operate anything like the kind of gender quota that I started with, which has been typical strategy for trying to address the underrepresentation of women in politics. Can we, as I'd rather like to think, dispense with that kind of categorical allocation and still both identify and challenge underrepresentation. So, I mean, one of the things that struck me most in beginning to think about this, beginning to think about the decertification of gender, is how horrified we would be if we treated race or religion or culture in the way we currently treat sex. I mean, we seem to, or most of us seem to find it obvious and uncontroversial that babies should be labeled male or female at birth, but would repudiate any suggestion that the state should assign us a specific racial, cultural, or religious identity and expect us to remain in that for the rest of our life. I mean, there are states that do this. And China's an interesting example because in China, ethnic identity is in fact used as part of a redistribution between under and overrepresented groups. So, you know, sometimes it's done for those reasons, but, you know, but generally, most of us would find it pretty abhorrent to be assigned a legally policed racial or ethnic identity based on judgments made by someone else about the precise color of our skin. And most of us would also object to any proposal, you know, for stamping us at birth with a particular cultural or religious identity. Again, this is done in some states, but fewer than used to be. Because, you know, I mean, while, you know, many willingly embrace the cultural traditions or religious beliefs of their parents, many others do not. And even those who do so would mostly resist the idea that, you know, of an identity assigned by others. So what, if anything, makes sex the exception, the exception to this? And I mean, I've already suggested that, I mean, part of the relative success of gender quotas is that gender does lend itself more readily to a binary. But, you know, anti-discrimination legislation, including measures for the, you know, the positive promotion of underrepresented groups, applies far more widely. There are, I mean, in the UK, there are 9 protected characteristics in the UK Equality Act, and of these, only 3, age, sex, and marital status, have a legally regulated character. It's true that the data on other protected characteristics is, as a result, somewhat less robust, you know, because it relies on self-description, and a certain proportion of respondents will always refuse to say. But the fact that we have no system of legal certification for example, for sexual orientation or ethnicity or social class, that hasn't of itself prevented initiatives to address inequality. When it comes to specifically political representation, moreover, it will never be the case, to quote an article by Suzanne Dovey, that, you know, just any woman will do. The point of something like a gender quota is not simply to equalize proportions of female and male bodies in politics, but also to enable representation of previously ignored interests and concerns. And that means political parties will be looking for more than the basic evidence that somebody is a woman. They're also looking for some indication that the women selected are likely to take on this representational task. I mean, it's been one of the arguments against self-certification that existing equality law might require organizations to accept as a woman anyone who is who has legally certified herself as such. So the argument is that you could end up in a situation where it would be an act of illegal discrimination to refuse access to possibly dubious applicants. So it would be an act of illegal. You know, somebody could declare themselves female or male, and say a man could declare himself female, and then it would be illegal discrimination to refuse access to women's prisons, women's refuges, or any woman's shortlist for political representation. And I think part of Davina Cooper's argument is that decertification, just taking the legal status of gender completely out of the picture, would actually provide a much more nuanced solution to this. So instead of it becoming a legally enforceable right for anyone who bears the relevant certificate to access a sex-specific facility, the management of access would depend, as in fact in most instances it already does, on more contextual judgment. So part of what they did in the report was do a lot of interviews of people who run women's refuges. And of course, those running women's refuges don't typically ask to see a birth certificate in order to determine who gets access. They make their decisions based on what the woman in question recounts of her experiences. This is something, that is, this is something that has its disadvantages, because you can see how this could possibly substitute substantive and intrusive scrutiny for formal legal membership. So in the context of stereotype views of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, there could be contexts in which this is less helpful to those who have transitioned than simply being able to produce a certificate. So, this is one of the arguments Mary Lang makes in a recent article she wrote from the Journal of Political Philosophy, where she argues that making the legal protections afforded to women, she's particularly arguing here about if you make the legal protections afforded to women depending on not whether you are sort of like medically identified as female, but whether you're perceived as female by others, which would be close to the kind of self-certification notion. That doing that, she argues, in her word, is cruel, because it would mean that the protections afforded by anti-discrimination law would depend basically on how well you pass as a woman. And if you don't conform to what others think of as a woman, it might give the impression that you therefore don't qualify. And actually, of course, this is precisely one of the problems that transgender people face, is that they are seen as not they're not conforming to other people's notions of what is a man and what is a woman, and they face a lot of harassment and abuse because of this. Now, I do think this is a problem with the elimination of any legal certification of sex. In a sense, if you don't have your certificate that says this is what I am, whether it's a birth certificate or a gender recognition certificate, it can leave people exposed to other people's judgments of what they are. Though, as we know, having a certificate in your back pocket, as I've just said, doesn't eliminate that. But then I'd come back here to the parallel, or rather contrast, with race. We do have legislation protecting people from racial discrimination, and yet we operate this without legally determining people's racial identities. And when issues come up about whether a particular form of discrimination is racial discrimination, or whether a particular attack is racially motivated, the courts do indeed make contextual judgments. But my second point, more about political representation, is that in the realm of political representation, the more substantive scrutiny seems exactly what you'd expect to happen. When political parties worry about the underrepresentation of particular social groups, they are going to look for candidates whose experiences within that group have alerted them to particular kinds of concerns, candidates who indicate their willingness to speak to and give voice to shared concerns. So the more substantive scrutiny in the context of political representation, rather than the waiving of a birth or gender recognition certificate, seems exactly right here. So far, I'm kind of on board with Cooper. In her argument, she goes further than I would, or than I think her case requires, and she challenges the general idea of women representing women, which of course is the issue that's kind of hovered for decades around the question of gender representation. And she describes her approach, just to quote from her, as a deliberate departure from interest group politics and its account of women as a group with assumed to be stable interests that need representation, and argues instead for a feminist politics that's just concerned more generally with subordination, exclusion, and exploitation. But it seems to me this is a false opposition. Challenging the stability and unity of something called women's interests has been a kind of staple of the feminist literature on political representation for decades. to the point where, skepticism about women as a unified interest group has been almost coterminous with arguments for their better representation. I mean, we all know the category of women is far too large and internally stratified for us to be able to attribute, one clearly defined set of shared interests. And of course, the dangers of attaching to the group women the concerns of interests of a more privileged subset are by now well rehearsed. I mean, it's also widely accepted that any political representation of the group women must attempt to capture something of the diversity of experience and not adopt some women as a proxy for all. So if you think about the work of Iris Marion Young, who's been one of my heroes as regards issues of democracy and representation, it seems to me that Cooper's critique of, quote, interest group politics and its account of women as a group with assumed to be stable interests that need representation, that could have come straight off the pages of Iris Young's work. But this didn't, for Young, in any way diminish the urgency of new forms of group representation. So I think part of what's at stake in Cooper's arguments is a larger argument in favor of prefigurative politics, which she sees as a kind of acting as if things were already otherwise, and thereby opening up our imaginations about what could be the case. So she calls on us to ditch the static image of women as a group with interests that need representation and act as if gender and sex were already what, of course, they most definitely are not. That is, elective, plural, and unfixed. So, I mean, I warm as many will to the idea of a world beyond fixed gender identities, and I also agree with the general direction of prefigurative politics, which tries to embed the character of the ultimate objectives in the ways in which we organize for these. But where women and the interests coded as female are so systematically underrepresented, as they still are in politics, but also in policing, higher education, the higher echelons of virtually every center of power, I think we have to resist premature abandonment of either women or women's interests. In some cases, the underrepresentation is actively maintained by what one can plausibly call institutionalized misogyny, and recent UK evidence about behavior and attitudes in the still, heavily male police and fire services has been really depressing in this respect. We think we've changed more than we have. But in all cases, the underrepresentation is associated with an under-prioritization of concerns coded as female, like the persistent failure in the UK and elsewhere to provide well-resourced and affordable childcare, and the shocking failure to secure convictions for rape. I call these coded as female because I don't accept the idea that these are only female concerns. This is not something, it seems to me, that one can challenge effectively through policies that act as if gender were already elective and unfixed. So really, this is where I end up. I mean, there is a problem in organizing as women in order to challenge the power of gender in our lives, but I see this as better understood as what historian Joan Scott calls the constitutive paradox of feminism, that in campaigning against the ways in which women are excluded, exploited, or regulated by gender, we almost inevitably call back into existence the very gender differences we reject. It's something that's, it's something, to me, it's something that at the moment, unfortunately, is inescapable. So Scott puts it like this. She says, feminism was a protest against women's political exclusion. Its goal was to eliminate sexual difference in politics, but it had to make its claims on behalf of women, who were, of course, discursively produced through sexual difference. To the extent that it acted for women, feminism produced the sexual difference it sought to eliminate. Now, my point, and I think this is also Scott's, is that we cannot easily evade this paradox. the solution, I think, is not to act as if it didn't exist, but just to keep that simultaneity, between both affirming and refusing gender always in mind. So long as the binary women men remains so horribly central to the organization of gender relations, we have to simultaneously work within and against it. So just to sum up, I don't think the idea of improving the political representation of women depends on legally regulated determination of who is and isn't a woman, any more than the idea of improving the political representation of racialized minorities or working class constituents depends on this. So I think the arguments for abandoning gender certification, whether the arguments for abandoning the medical certification that prioritizes biology, or the argument for just completely abandoning certification entirely, they strike me as pretty strong arguments as regards the sphere of political representation. I mean, I'm not fully committing myself beyond that, though I incline towards Cooper's proposals overall. But whichever way one goes, the same balancing act remains, a balancing act between simultaneously affirming and refusing the power of gender. Affirming because if you don't recognize the power of gender, you live in a kind of utopian world in which you imagine everything's already fine. It isn't. So you have to affirm the power of gender while at the same time refusing it, refusing as much as possible its power in determining who and what we are. It's not, I think, always an easy act, but it's not incoherent to see oneself as engaged simultaneously in both those things. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.